always ask where the joy is in the project, and if there is none, I usually think it's not worth making. And the reality is, even quite heavy subjects, you can find some sort of joy, some sort of empowerment, something uplifting. It's quite rare that it's just completely bleak.
Yes.
But so, for example, it's BAFTA season. I've been to a lot of the viewings. I saw the film Blonde, the about Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
That's an interesting film because I don't know if you've seen it, but when you look at it, I can see no joy in that film. I really wonder why it was made. And interestingly, I met the producer just before the screening, and he was weirdly apologetic. He was sort of trying to warn me about what it would be like going into the screening. And I think I know why, because it was devoid of joy. And it had nothing really um, positive or constructive to say in the world, really.
Yeah.
That was my abiding impression. So the answer to your question is, I always ask people, where's the joy in the project? If there isn't any, I'm quite reluctant to go ahead with it. But that doesn't mean that the projects are rose tinted glasses.
Hi, Adam. Welcome to Ideology Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you specifically about your Jewish identity and what being Jewish means. I'm sure it differs being British Jewish, and also your experience of being someone who is Jewish and working in media.
Okay, happy to talk about that. Fire away.
So, first of all, I would have to admit that to me, the Jewish identity isn't obvious, and I can't mostly tell who is a Jew just by looking at them.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. And then I found that actually, as someone who didn't grow up in Europe, a lot of the history takes me a while to sink in. And so I feel like most people, I feel ignorant, and also just looking back on our time together working when we worked in new media in 2005, when we worked together in a department called new media. um, I remember, we talked a lot about diversity and identity, but mostly the focus was on being Muslim, being black. And so I feel like my ignorance comes from my own sort of navel gazing, where I only really think of my own identity and how racism affects people from my own background. So when now I'm seeing that everything in the media seems to be almost showing me that actually anti-Semitism has existed far longer than now that it's caught our attention. And I'm trying to go back in my mind and thinking, how many things did I just not really see as being anti-Semitic, and how much did I just also not question things?
Okay. I'll do my best to remember all those questions. Let me start at the beginning. So, I mean, the thing about being Jewish, or European Jewish or Anglo Jewish, um, is, like you say, you can't really see it. I mean, some people are quite good at. They've got a finely tuned Judar. So, for example, my ex-wife's quite good at it. She can spot a Jew at 100 paces, sort of thing. And some people have got good instinct for it, but by and large, you can't tell. And on that level, it's quite like being gay. You're sort of under the radar, and it's in your control to whether you care to disclose it or not. So, unlike, say, being black, where you just got no options, when you're a white Jew, you can either decide to disclose it or not. By and large, I'm open about it. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be on this podcast. Um, and I'm comfortable about it in most cases, but there are times when I don't reveal it, and quite often in recent times that's been in the presence of some form of anti-Semitism. So that kind of links to your other question. I didn't really experienced any anti-Semitism for about nearly 5 decades of my life. The first anti-Semitism I experienced was when I was joining, let's call it a club. It's kind of a club. And I was sat between the person that proposed me for the club and this guy that was a knight of the realm. It was my first night as a member of the club. And there was a conversation going on between these two people, and they started talking about charity. And then they started talking about how charity was done in New York and in America, and the fact that people like to have their names clearly associated with their donations and stuff. And then they said one of those "them people" kind of phrases, and it obviously referred to Jews, New York Jews in this case, that gave charitable donations and wanted their name on whatever it was that they were donating towards. And it was sort of, just a mild, everyday sort of form of anti-Semitism, but it's the first time I came across it, pretty much ever. In the subsequent years, so that's only, I don't know, maybe that's like just over 10 years ago. Since then, I've come across it more often, including at Channel 4 where we worked, just casually in a meeting at Film 4. So I have come across it more. I've also heard it in the street with activists locally, where we were on a library march, and I just heard some Labour Party people from Liverpool with some casual anti-Semitism right next to me. So it's cropped up a bit more than in the first big chunk of my life, but I haven't really experienced it in a very full-on form. One other thing that I actually remember, probably actually the first time I experienced it, was when I went to Ireland when I got married, and went to my then wife's village, and one of her uncles said a phrase like "clever as a Jew boy," but he knew I was Jewish, but he didn't make the connection. And he didn't say it in a malevolent way. It was just like everyday kind of racism, really. I mean, just to get this bit of I didn't want to come on here particularly and talk a lot about anti-Semitism. I mean, for the most part, I don't really. You have to pick what battles you fight, and so as an example of that night when I joined the club, it was my first time there. I was like, oh shit, am I going to have to take on this battle today? I just read that book, The Kite Runner. I can't remember that much about The Kite Runner, but I remember it revolves around whether a person stands up for his friend or something or not, whether he speaks up or not. And I was in that kind of situation, or I made the association, and I just decided I wasn't going to have that battle that day. I mean, the funny thing is, I didn't want to have that battle on the first day, and it didn't seem like the right moment. But the funny thing is, a bit later, they asked me to read the lessons at the Christmas service that was associated with this club. So, I found myself in a church reading a bit of the Bible. And for me, that was my kind of triumph, because they still don't know I'm Jewish. And I have no intentions of telling them, because it's a sort of I don't know if it's not really a hostile atmosphere, but I don't feel comfortable in it in that respect. So I just never tell them, and they don't know. They might do after this, but what the hell?
I don't think you'll be. I'll doubt they'll see it.
Who knows? I don't care that much, and actually, generally, I don't care that much about anti-Semitism or fighting anti-Semitism, in the sense that I don't care. I mean, I'm 59 years old now. I don't really give a shit what most people think about anything to do with me, including that, because that's sort of the characteristic of being in your 50s. But I don't care about it for the most part. because it's the other people's problem. I'd care about it if we were sliding into a situation like Nazi Germany. And just to give this some framework, my grandparents fled Nazi Germany they arrived in Croydon, of all places, in May 1939. So they just got out of Germany. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. They fled from Leipzig. And so obviously they got full on anti-Semitism that was life or death. I haven't really felt like that. Another thing I'll just mention is my stepdad was involved in a group called the 43 Group, which was an anti-fascist group after the war. Funnily enough, it included amongst its number Vidal Sassoon, the hairdresser. But they fought the fascists, the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley, believe it or not, after the war. Lots of people think it happened before the war, but extraordinarily, they were on the streets again after the war. And my stepdad, his brother, and their group basically just went out on the streets and fought them. And, I think probably, that was the kind of order of anti-Semitism where you had to do something about it. And funnily enough, my stepdad was not politically sophisticated. He was a market trader. And when asked, why did he do it? He just said, I just felt, I felt and I knew it was the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So I'm very proud of what he did. And, that's a whole other level. But for the most part, for the stuff, all this stuff, let's talk about it as it's sort of been around recently, but with Kanye, that other I don't know what he was, basketball player or something like that.
Yeah.
It's they just demonstrate what fools they are really, and how they just swallow this age-old kind of anti-Semitic tropes, which anyone with half a brain can kind of see through. And I was very impressed actually by Jon Stewart on the Stephen Colbert show recently, where he kind of just took the piss out of it in a smart way, because that's all it really deserves, and he did it really well. So that's anti-Semitism, and until it gets anything like Cable Street proportions or Nazi Germany proportions, I hardly give it the time of day, and I live my life.
Yeah.
And I have that advantage that I can go underground. I can control a lot of the situations, which I know, my black friends, my brown friends, and various others, they can't, they don't have that luxury. So I do appreciate that I've got that kind of luxury.
Yeah.
So to move on from that, I'm covering your questions kind of broadly, but I might not go. But to move on from that, I used to think of myself as kind of culturally Jewish. So being Jewish is quite complicated, because it's certainly a kind of culture, it's certainly a religion, it's arguably a nationality, and it's certainly an ethnicity. So that's what makes it so complicated. So if we go through those, culturally, I would say I'm definitely Jewish. I didn't realise it until I went to Cambridge to university, and I'd always thought of myself as really English. I loved where I grew up. I always felt totally at home. I always thought, I'm in the right place. And I felt totally English. Then I went to Cambridge and I met a different kind of person that I didn't grow up with. And then I suddenly realised, actually, I'm massively shaped by my Jewish cultural heritage, much more than anything English. So I don't think of myself as English in the same way ever since then, really. Not that I'm any less fond of English and Englishness and England, but I just know that I'm kind of shaped by other stuff.
What specifically was it that you realized actually was different about the way you saw yourself as English versus the way you came?
It was all the sort of Oxbridgey, Boris Johnson-y, Bullingdon club type of stuff, but also sort of slightly lower level, upper middle class version of that as well.
Mm.
Um, kind of county set, and I just never really kind of connected with that. So the second thing was the religion. That's quite simple, and I hope I'm not holding your podcast below the waterline here. But in terms of religion, I'd really like to believe, but I don't at all.
Mm-hmm.
I find, sometimes I think about. I know that, for example, that Einstein was quite religious Jew and a
Mm-hmm.
real believer, and obviously he was a smart guy. And I'm like, well, why is it not good enough for me? But I just don't believe in it, and I can't bring myself to. So if I was trying to sort of describe my religion, I think I'm something a bit more like a pantheist. I
Mm-hmm.
have a sense of God in the things around me. It's as good a word as any to try and communicate this sense of patterns and order that underlies things. But yeah, that's about as near as I can get, really. I'd say I'm a kind of pantheist, and I detect it mostly in kind of nature. That's the easiest place.
Mm-hmm.
Then Jews as a nation. Um, it's kind of tricky. It sort of feels kind of biblical, really. It's of that era, really. I don't really think about us that much in those terms. And then Jews as ethnicity. Well, that is the one. That's where I've had a complete turnaround
Mm-hmm.
in recent years. So I was listening in the car with my older son to a podcast
Mm-hmm.
with Seth Rogen, where he was talking about. He had some quite contentious things to say about Israel,
Mm-hmm.
um, which were interesting and a good, an interesting perspective. But he was also talking quite a lot about Judaism as an ethnicity, which had never been bottom of my list prior to that. But then about a couple of months later, so this is just before the lockdowns, I think, I had a DNA test
Mm-hmm.
because my son had, and there was, I can't remember, he had a percentage of Spanish or something in his DNA. So we were like, oh, let's try and work out whether that's me or your mum, sort of thing. And so I got my test back, and I paid I think I paid 40 quid for it, and my test result fundamentally was like one line, and the one line said 100% Ashkenazi, and it was super disappointing because I was desperate to have a bit of Native American. I knew it was a long shot, but just
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of a kind of interesting mix. But it said 100% Ashkenazi. So, which for those that don't know that term, it's a European type of Jew as opposed to a Mediterranean type of Jew or Middle Eastern type of Jew. Um, so, I was online to someone at the time, and I knew that they were Jewish, and I said, and I just kind of paused while I was opening the letter, and I said, or the email, and I said, "Oh, sorry about the pause. I was just getting my DNA results, and I was just opening it." And I said, "Have you had it done?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What company did you use?" And it was the same one. And I said, "What did your one look like? Like, did it have any kind of subtleties? Did it have any smaller percentages? A little bit of Greek, a little bit of I don't know anything,
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Yeah, same company." And yeah, I had like I don't know 10%. He was about like 68% Ashkenazi and a bit of Italian and a bit of something else. And so I said, so it's like, okay, so this test can detect
Yeah,
small
distinguish between.
percentages. So they honestly have given me an 100% Ashkenazi result. And then I sort of thought, well, how amazing to be 100% anything. So
Yeah.
ever since then, I've considered myself a thoroughbred Ashkenazi.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean, being serious, what I have suddenly thought is actually the ethnicity is important. And I remember Seth Rogen sort of kind of getting across the point that it's something you can't do anything about. If you do a DNA test, it comes back 100% Ashkenazi or whatever the kind of mix is, and it's substantially Jewish. That's just what you are. It's no different from being, uh, you know, black or any other kind of ethnicity. It's a sort of same sort of thing. So yeah, I think of myself in those terms much more than I used to. So for me, first and foremost, it's just an ethnicity, and I can't do anything about it. It's just how I arrived, and I don't want to do anything about it either. But it's just I treat it in the same way as if I was a person of color, or I suppose in some ways, if I had a particular sort of sexual orientation or anything like that, um, I treat it like that, really.
Yeah. Um, what really struck me actually, just watching what Jon Stewart said yesterday, was, when he was asked, "Do you think they're normalizing anti-Semitism?" And he said, "Actually, it's been pretty normal. It's not that this is happening now."
Yeah.
And that was really interesting because it makes you realize, if it was, then why is it? What are your thoughts on why it's acceptable to speak this way?
I think a lot of it is to do with the monotheistic religions, and it's kind of an Oedipal thing, because Judaism was the source of both Christianity
Christian.
and Islam. There's an element of like killing the father type of thing. I think that's been a massive thing, and it's sort of, in a way, it's totally kind of understandable. That's just the way things work, really. So I think that's a big aspect of it. I mean, what else? I mean, it long predates the creation of the modern state of Israel. So I'm sure that's generated plenty of anti-Semitism, but there was tons of it before anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in those books behind me, what can I see? T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, plenty of casual anti-Semitism there. John Buchan, loads of casual anti-Semitism there. It's not even that malevolent. It's just normal for the 1920s or 30s or whenever he was writing those books. I mean, it has been around. It has been around a lot.
I'm surprised to hear you say that. That, for the most part, the way you deal with it is just to think, you know what, it says more about you than it does about me. Because one of the tropes that I've become aware of is, this whole thing about, Jewish people who work in media, Jewish,
I was
and
going to come to that. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry. I was going to come to that because we had a mutual colleague at Channel 4, actually, who I was really good friends with. And then one day, when we were at lunch just talking, she came up with this thing about, well, Jews do own the media though, don't they? And I was really surprised. I didn't sort of really say anything, but I was really surprised because we were and we remained good friends, but I was really surprised that she came out with that. I think Jon Stewart captured it really well, which is just because Jews might be kind of prominent in different sort of businesses, it doesn't mean they own them or control them. Because if we controlled them, we'd have much better PR. As I don't know who that is. I think it's Sarah Silverman in David Baddiel's program that's going to be on next Friday night at 9 p.m. on Channel 4. But she says that more or less, like if we were controlling it all, we'd have better PR than we have. So I don't know. I mean, Jews kind of punch above their weight in some ways because there's a massive value around education, and also as refugees, as I say, my grandparents pitched up here in 1939, and we changed our name as well from a German one to a sort of neutral one for obvious reasons. The first thing they do is, and it's similar to other incoming migrants, is they try and get their kids educated, and they set a lot of store by it, and so it's not just Jews that do that, but it's a big thing. So if Jews are sort of punch above their weight a bit in terms of certain areas, it's as much science as it is media. It's all sorts of things. It's partly because of the sort of emphasis on education and the focus on education. I suppose there are all sorts of other things. I mean, sometimes it helps to be something of an outsider. Can give you a clearer perspective on certain things. Um, but yeah, so that whole thing with the media, I think it's largely just a reflection of the fact that, you know, probably Jews over-index in lots of professions, you know, especially law. Funnily enough, actually, I was just reading a kind of pulp fiction sort of paperback this morning, which is a novel where the kind of detective character is actually a rabbi, and he uses kind of Talmudic biblical scholarship to sort of solve the crimes because it's a way of thinking. And the bit that I was reading this morning was a lot to do with basically kind of how law is captured in the Old Testament. There's vast tracts of it which are literally like kind of law books. You know, what do you do when one person wrongs another? And it was evident. I'm no expert in this, but it was evident in what I read this morning that a lot of detail is there about these things. And funnily enough, you know, in the story that I was reading, the rabbi was making it clear that when you go to the Bible to find out what the law is around this particular thing and of one person wronging another, the description is to do with oxen and you know, sort of and animals, whereas what he was applying it to was something to do with one person borrowing another person's car and not looking after it. But he went back to the Bible to find the law around it. Similarly, I'm not much of a synagogue goer, but I went to someone's bat mitzvah, which is a female bar mitzvah, a couple of months ago, and every week in the synagogue they read out another chunk of the Bible so that they get through the whole thing during the course of the year and then start again at the beginning. And the bit that they read was all about. I mean, it was interesting because obviously the invasion of Ukraine was well underway at that point, but it's all about the kind of rules and laws around what you do when you defeat an enemy in battle, and you know what you're entitled to take, how you should treat the people themselves, their families, or their kind of compatriots, you know. So I was well, two things struck me: how legalistic it was. So it's just a chunk from, I think it was from Exodus, but I might have got that wrong. But it was very kind of legalistic. It's one thing, but then the other thing that struck me about it was totally kind of brutal. It was very much that thing that people think about, you know, with the Old Testament. In fact, it was the bit where an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth comes from. Because that goes on. It's not just an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but it's something like a hand for a hand. You know, it's like the kind of cliche that people would have about Islamic law, but it's there in the Jewish biblical law. And a lot of the things it said, certainly by our standards, we'd find really kind of unacceptable. Like, I'd love to know how rabbis explain some of the things in there in terms of the kind of brutality and the harshness that just doesn't compute in the modern world.
Yeah.
So, for example, you know, what you're allowed to do with captives, or I can't remember the detail of it, or with, you know, with the community that you kind of capture or whatever. It's just stuff. I don't know how they would explain it away, but it's you know, it's as brutal as anything you ever hear about any kind of religious law. So I see that as much as any other kind of ancient laws like that as just of their time. It actually doesn't really apply.
Yeah.
You know,
I find what's interesting is just like in terms of conspiracy theories, you find a lot of it, and I became aware of this, especially when the Labour Party started to be talked about, as you know, when it made news for having and tolerating a lot of anti-Semitism. I would say before that, actually, I was someone who would never consider voting Conservative or any other party. But it just was a shock to see that a party like the Labour Party, that is about, you know, tolerance and all of these values, was not coming out really strongly straight away, and really making it clear how they don't tolerate it. And
Yeah.
another thing I would have to say, it's been a slow drip feed for me, was when I went to university. I met a young woman from Israel, and she actually ended up having to leave in the first year because she said she just couldn't tolerate the anti-Semitism. And having even experienced that, it's you just take all these things in isolation, and it's
Mm,
very easy to just go back to Black Lives Matter, go back to this, and just focus on what's going on in your life without
mm,
really ever putting yourself in someone else's shoe. And so,
mm.
my whole thing now is just to try and really see how are my Jewish friends processing this, you know?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of that Labour Party thing, there's great irony. So my other grandfather, who was born in Dagenham, very working class, or very much working class, and whose family would have come here in Victorian times, so a few generations earlier. He was, he was absolutely kind of staunch Labour supporter, as are tons of Jews, and especially of his generation.
Hmm.
And of course, tons of sort of left-wing radicals and anarchists have been Jewish, lots of the key ones. And of course, Karl Marx was, and
Mm-hmm.
loads of other people that are the kind of roots of the Labour Party. So there's a great kind of irony there. I mean, in terms of that time specifically, I mean, I think Corbyn was both a kind of anti-Semite and an absolute kind of fool as well. Like, take, for example, that whole affair with the mural down in the East End. Like, it was just idiotic what he said, and it's so easy to um, pick apart what's going on in that mural. Like, it's really obvious if you just look from picture to picture to picture, and you look at how the faces are distorted. They're distorted in a way that would fit quite happily into Der Stürmer magazine in Nazi Germany. They just lengthen the nose a bit, make it a little bit more hooked, and that person that's not even Jewish would turn him into a Jew. Um, so he was just a fool, and in many ways, actually. So that it was a kind of sad period for that party, and they kind of got what they deserved as well. Um,
Yeah.
so and there were a few voices, but what happened to some of the Labour MPs, female Labour MPs and stuff, was pretty disgusting.
Mm.
Um, And then, I mean, what you were talking about there about the person you met at university. I mean, obviously, once you bring in the question of Israel, it's complicated, because being anti-Israel is not being anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
But where do you stand on that in terms of, are you visited Israel a few times or?
yeah, I've been to Israel. Yeah. Um, where do I stand on it?
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of it's kind of sort of built into the whole Jewish identity, that we're from that part of the world, and in some ways we might be well positioned, um, or we might be well served in trying to go back to that part of the world when you go through the whole history of really kind of full-on anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, the pogroms and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
and right up to the Nazi period, really. So I think it is part of the identity, and one of the best people. Sorry, I don't know the exact reference, but if you look online, and look at Howard Jacobson talking about anti-Semitism, he's really good at explaining why you can't really fully you can't fully really separate Jewishness from Israel, and there's a kind of baked in connection there. So I do think it's really difficult. I think the situation with Palestinians is, has been kind of tragic over the years, and also there's been plenty of bad behaviour on the part of the Israeli state.
Mm. But how do you distinguish
But
that? So now if you're in a meeting.
you do have to separate out the Israeli state from, well, certainly from Jews in general, because they're far from being one and the same thing. But you'd think it was the same thing in lots of cases, probably like your colleague, that you met at university.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely a complicating factor, and there's no simple answers to it. It's a bit like, there's just no simple answers. I mean, it's a very knotty post-colonial problem that's similar to all sorts of other ones, like, for example, Northern Ireland. There are no simple answers to these things. It takes absolutely kind of generations to unpick it at all.
Yeah.
Same as South Africa as well. I mean, we can see it's going to take so long to work through that whole
Legacy of apartheid. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of in that sort of territory, and yeah, so I don't underestimate how it complicates things, but also I think there's a lot of real kind of propaganda. A lot of people are really kind of brainwashed from the outset, kind of on both sides, really, because that's what Seth Rogen was talking about. He felt he'd been a bit brainwashed about Israel, and the same applies to the other sides. I think lots of people in the Middle East are pretty brainwashed about Israel, but it's not very difficult to do. So what can I say? It needs dialogue. It needs dialogue, and it needs compromise on both sides. And I don't think any of that's going to be easy. There's been times in history where we've got a little bit closer, and then people have disrupted it. So,
are you happy to talk? So I want to know what the difference is, because there's clearly a difference between what's going on here and what's going on in America. So it seems to me that something flares up in America and it quickly catches fire here in Britain. Do you feel there's a different experience of being a British Jew and being an American Jew?
Yeah, it is pretty different. I'm not sure I can tell. I don't know enough about how American Jews operate to know what the differences are. But I think, we definitely have a different sort of mentality. I wonder, trying to think who feels safer, really. I mean, an interesting thing is, like, when we were growing up, my younger brother, who's 6 years younger, was pretty convinced that it was possible. So this would have been in, let's say, in the 80s, was pretty convinced that it's possible that we'd have to run away from Britain in the face of some kind of anti-Semitism at some point. Like, he was pretty convinced that would happen, and I was like, just can't see that ever happening. And
how old at this age?
He would have been, I don't know, like a young teenager or something like that. I don't know if he feels as strongly like that anymore, but he did at the time. And I remember my grandfather gave us both a gold sovereign, which I'm not sure. I think it's worth like a couple of £100 or something. But he gave it to us with the mentality. So this is our German grandfather. With the mentality that if we had to run suddenly, gold sovereign is really useful, very portable sort of thing. So it's part of the, it's definitely part of the mindset. I don't really kind of feel it. I don't think it's sort of impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely.
So I looked at this, some research, and it was saying that attacks against Jews since 2000, it was less than 1,000 to suddenly, the stats are really shocking, actually. So 2,107 by the time it's 2019. So in 2019, 2,107.
I mean, you have to realize, like, we grew up.
This is in British Jews. This is America.
Oh, America, okay, but it's the same here. We grew up here where we had to have like security guards. We still do on the synagogue gate, sort of thing. That's just kind of standard. My stepbrother volunteered to be like a security guard. There's a charity that runs all that stuff. Uh, so that's kind of become normalized. When
How
I lived,
long ago would you say this has started to happen?
oh, when years and years ago, when I probably was in my 20s, sort of thing. Yeah, not when I was a tiny kid, but in my 20s. So, like in the 80s, basically. And there's this kind of trust that was set up to supply security people.
Private security, not the police, right?
Yeah, it's not the police. Yeah, you can't get the police, and it would spread them so thin as well. Like it's a lot of stuff to cover. But yeah, it's just sort of it's volunteers. It's volunteers. So my stepbrother, who's a little bit younger, he used to do it. I think he probably still does. And then I lived in France for a year before I went to university. That was instructive. So just as another example, because I think things are much worse actually in France than in the UK. But so I lived in quite a small town, but it had a synagogue, but it was almost impossible to find. It was like you might as well have been looking for a speakeasy or something. Took forever to actually find it, and then to go into it as a stranger was almost impossible. So, that gives you a sense of how things are in France, and I think generally the French Jews feel much more under threat. And ironically, that's probably partly due to there being such a big Islamic population. But then the great irony was when I was in that town and I used to walk into my uni where I was going for the year, I would regularly see the French police hassling Algerians on the street, just for the hell of it. They were just standing there, they weren't doing anything. So, all this kind of hatred doesn't really get anyone anywhere, really.
No.
So, yeah.
Which one would you say is the safest country that you visited? Do you feel like there's a place where it feels welcoming to
Yeah, the the answer's sort of obvious, but it's Israel. And the great irony is, like, go to a place that's completely surrounded by hostile neighbors, highly kind of militarized, and you feel safe only in the sense that it's exactly the same. Like, one of my best friends is second generation Jamaican. When I went to his wedding with lots of his friends from Birmingham and Manchester who hadn't been to the wedding was in Jamaica. Lots of his friends hadn't been to Jamaica before, which is where their families had originated from. They all had a bit of a sense, or they expected to sort of go home, and be welcomed and to feel comfortable. But in fact, as these things go, they were perceived by the local population as pretty almost as foreign as we were. There wasn't that much in it, and that was kind of disappointing. And that happens when you go to Israel as well. If I go to Israel, I'm kind of perceived as pretty much as foreign as anyone else that goes. Wow. But you have a real sense of ease because you're not going to be on the receiving end of anything anti-Semitic, and you're kind of with your tribe. You get that feeling. So it's quite nice just to be able to relax, because it just shows that actually in a day-to-day basis, somewhere deep in the background, we're conscious that we're on foreign soil, or whatever you put it. You're not with your own sort of thing. But it's funny. I mean, I don't like tribalism. Really. I can't bear. I can hardly bear going to football because it's so tribal. And I hate that kind of mentality, and I hate watching fathers transmitting it onto their children there as well. But
isn't it interesting? One thing I've noticed is actually, if you look at in terms of like assimilation, you would think Jewish people have more than any other group.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just an observation that I have. I look at you, you've married, a Catholic.
Yeah.
That would never happen in my culture,
Well, it didn't happen easily in our culture either, and particularly in slightly earlier generations, it probably eases off a little bit over time, but it is a big deal. And I had to really kind of stand up for what I was doing. So, my dad, for example, became just really kind of antagonistic. So suddenly he went from having no interest in Northern Irish politics to suddenly being an expert. And he'd bring it up every time I brought my then girlfriend home. And I just had to stand up to it, because otherwise you're building in destruction, kind of thing. So
I think you're right. These
go
things
easily
take time.
Sorry?
I feel like you're right. These things take time, and
Well, he didn't kind of come round to things until we had our first child, and then he saw how we were bringing him up, and then suddenly he kind of softened up, really.
and what did he like? Did he like that you were continuing with Jewish traditions, for example?
Well, I mean, I wasn't, because it's a matrilinear religion, so the mother has to be Jewish. So technically, he's not neither of my children are Jewish. Although in the more kind of liberal bits of Judaism, they kind of accept them. But with my mum, after I started going out with with this same girlfriend, was forever trying to kind of hook me up with a Jewish girlfriend, even though she knew I was going out with someone at the time. So
It's
it
good
doesn't
to know
get
it's
easy.
universal.
Yeah, exactly. And I was at a funeral, at a kind of, not a funeral, but kind of a wake, a shiva, which is a wake, really, last week. It was the father of one of my school friends, and it became evident that my friend's older brother, who is a very kind of respected person, and talking about assimilation, he's actually a knight of the realm as well, as of a little while ago. So he's very preeminent in he's the top of his profession, his specialism. But he had a terrible relationship with his father that had died, because he had married out and married someone that was not Jewish, and it was really extreme how the dad behaved, and how the dad treated this guy's children when they came along.
Oh wow!
So it's pretty full on, like a bit like you'd sort of expect with, say in an Islamic setting. It's not unusual that the idea of bringing in an outsider is really going against the grain.
Yeah. What would you say is a trope that just really gets on your goat, that you think, oh, I don't even wanna, I can't believe this is even a thing?
Well, I think this kind of secret Jewish conspiracy that to sort of run the world kind of thing is ridiculous. And also,
have you not been invited to a club, Adam, that you can also invite me to?
No, I haven't been invited to a club, but I've had the opposite. I've been invited to the club of the British establishment. So when I was just about to leave Cambridge as a modern linguist, I got a little note slipped under the door to see whether I was interested in joining MI5. So those clubs and those underground networks are just probably more real and more active than some worldwide Zionist conspiracy. So also, like, Jews are rich, I find that one really annoying, not least when you sort of think back to European Jewry before the war was kind of living in shtetls or small villages, very confined in what they could do, so not able to do loads of professions because of the laws of the different countries they were living in. So there were plenty of poor Jews then, and there are plenty of poor Jews now. So that's kind of a faintly irritating one. What else? I mean, I thought it was funny. John, what's his name? Sorry, what's his name? John
Jon Stewart.
Stewart. Yeah, talking about the sports guy and how it was
Oh yeah, the
uplift.
Twitter, the
Yeah,
sports guy who it was trending, and at least
yeah,
finally.
yeah. To be that was it. To be trending in a sports context was really uplifting for for Jews because they're not a huge reputation in sports. Um, Although actually there are some conspicuous ones knocking around, but it's not our biggest forte. I quite like that also the fact that like we're not great at sort of DIY type of things, and I quite like some of the sort of self-deprecating humor around the fact that we're not really sort of well versed in fixing stuff around the house and so forth. Although I'm sure there are plenty, it's a kind of a trope as well.
Yeah.
Has a certain truth in it, but only limited. Um, so I don't spend much time thinking about that really.
Yeah.
I don't.
I
I
think,
mean,
like you say, I think you and I grew up in a time where I feel we were shielded from so much.
mm,
I look at my life too, where being black, it's not the same experience that maybe someone who's black today is having. And
yeah,
so I'm more thinking about, I always thought of, history as forever progressive, and
mm.
really I have this utopian version of the world, and it comes somehow from the fact that we were able to live in a time where we did see a period when the trajectory of the world was
I mean, I think
continuous.
there have been a lot. There has been so much progress in so many things. I think particularly um, around some kind of sensitivity to ethnicity, to in terms of female empowerment. I mean, obviously, there's still tons of stuff that's wrong and a long way to go, but there's definitely been sort of massive progress, and
Yeah.
people are much more sensitive. I mean, I'm much older than you, and I grew up in the generation of Love Thy Neighbor, which is just like racism on mainstream TV. And that sort of thing doesn't really happen much these days, and to some degree, the contrary. So I think there has been a lot of progress, but I think the internet has thrown up a lot of problems in a lot of areas of life. So you talked about us when we worked at Channel 4 New Media, and we were very much involved in internet culture. Um,
Mm-hmm.
can't pretend that I don't sometimes feel guilty about contributing to it, but I have tried hard in my career to use it to good ends. But
In what
nonetheless,
way do you feel it's harmful? How do you think?
I think it's toxic for young people. My girlfriend's son, um, when after the invasion of Ukraine and when Putin started talking about and hinting about tactical nuclear weapons and stuff, he was really kind of totally freaked by the media and the both the online media and the press and social media. But he was completely kind of freaked out by the whole thing, like proper freaked out, where he was, probably how people felt about the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war in my parents' generation. But he was proper freaked out and was really concerned that something was imminent.
Mhm.
Um, so it's very difficult on mental health.
Yeah.
Um,
But as you say now, there are no distinguishing features anymore, because it's to me it feels like normal media, the press, just takes the trolls and crafts that into a whole article.
yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. So I think that's one of the things that has become much more difficult, and also this sort of I think the threat of climate change is or the climate emergency is another thing that weighs heavily on people. I don't envy people growing up at this time. I don't envy my kids for when they've grown up. I've got one. I think one's a millennial and one's a Gen Z. Um, But I don't really envy them. Like there was something a lot simpler about life.
Yeah. How do you think they experience being Jewish today?
Well, they're half. They're half Catholic, half Jewish.
Yeah.
They both kind of appreciate both their heritages. Um, the younger one walks around with something. I think he bought it when he went on a school trip to Poland. He's got a chain around his neck, and it's got a cross and a Star of David on it. And he seems to wear that all the time, even when he's wearing very little else. That's always there.
Yeah. So they feel empowered, right? To
I think he feels some warmth towards both heritages, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it reminds me, I never went out with anyone Jewish in my entire life. I nearly did once, but we ended up we had one snog in Covent Garden, and then realised that we'd be better off as friends, and we remained friends ever since. But other than that person, I have never gone out with a Jewish girl. I've always really been attracted to difference.
Mm.
And pretty much most of my girlfriends have been from some different sort of background.
Yeah, I think actually saying that's what I found confusing with whenever these stereotypes come up. I just think I look at all the Jewish people I know, and I think no two are alike, but yet the way we talk about Jewish people is as if they're this monolith. I don't know.
That's the same as anything, isn't it? That's the same as anything. I don't know if you remember when at Channel 4, I did a project called Osama Loves. You remember that? Osama Loves.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that actually.
And the whole point of that project was so it was at the time when the famous or infamous Osama was still with us, and the idea was, the brief had been to try and show that Islam as a culture was not homogenous, but was actually heterogeneous, and it was very different growing up as a Muslim in Cairo to Bradford. And what we did was we sent two young British Muslims out across the world in search of people called Osama, which I was reliably informed is sort of about as common a name as Keith is in English. And they went to find Osama's, and then they went to ask them what they loved. And obviously, as you'd expect, they said everything from web design to fish and chips and Wayne Rooney and all things in between. And then those things were sort of published on a website, and interestingly enough, also at one point published as a double-page colour spread in The Sun, where you just saw all these different Osamas and all the different things they loved. And it was completely evident that it's not a homogenous culture.
No.
And also, they're not that different from us. What they loved was kind of what loads of British people love, and loads of people in other places. So, yeah, I mean, it's always nonsensical to sort of just assume there's some sort of homogenous group, because there never is in terms of ethnicity or religion or anything else, really. It's very rarely the case.
Yeah. Do you think if this escalates, that it then will affect Jewish people so that they do have to draw more into their identity? How do you think this will change?
In America or worldwide?
Even worldwide, really, because the thing is, just looking back at 9/11 and how that changed overnight, I never really thought too much about even my own name. But after 9/11, suddenly I thought I might never be able to travel as Safia Ahmed,
Yeah.
that I wasn't going to change my name.
We're kind of used to all of that. My grandfather's name, the one that was born in Dagenham, his name was Isidore. He never could get a job or a job interview until he changed it to Ian, and until he changed Hersovitz to Harris. Once he was Ian Harris, no problem, he got on fine. And it's much the same. I should be called Adam Gewurz, but circumstances were such that it was pragmatic to change the name when they arrived here. And
That's really sad to think, Adam, honestly. Or even
yeah,
just, yeah.
my older son was kind of keen at one point to revert to the original surname. My
Hmm.
younger one decided that GEE was too long and just thought that he ditched the two E's. So they've gone in different directions. Um, but yeah, I mean,
Have
do you
you
know
thought about that, about what
what?
that does to you when your name has been shed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just par for the course for us. We don't really think about it that much. On
Hmm.
top of which, on the specifics of that, every Jew has a Hebrew name anyway, which is different from their English name. So my kind of Hebrew name is unaffected. Um, Not that I go around using it, but I do think of it as part of my identity. And one of the things I like about it is it contains your father's name in it as well.
Oh,
In fact, at that wake or shiva that I went to last week, I noticed that and I'd never heard it before. But I think there were more kind of reform or liberal Jews, the woman running the service. Yeah, it would have been because it was a woman running the service for a start off. But interestingly, when I heard them say the guy that had died's Hebrew name, it had both the mother and the father, which I'd never heard the mother in it before. So maybe that's a done thing now, which would be a good thing. But I kind of quite like the fact that it's your father's name's kind of yoked into it, and now with a bit of luck, your mother's name's yoked into it as well.
okay. So then does it mean that you're able to distinguish your identity? You're able to almost be, who this moment, what the moment calls for versus, and then also knowing what your history is.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a nice little bit of the identity, really, that keeps you sort of connected to it. But I mean, it's funny as well because just in the context of this conversation. But my Hebrew name is Abraham Yitzhak, which is Abraham Isaac, who I think they kind of made it through to both of the other two monotheistic religions.
Yes.
And then the next bit is Ben, which is exactly the same as bin, meaning son of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then Shimon Zev, which are, that's the equivalent of Simon, and I don't know what Zev even is actually, but
Wow.
if nothing else, it makes me think of my dad from time to time, which is no bad thing.
So are you then so when you look at your own culture and then you see, for example, something like that, Shimon,
Mm,
Simon, Abraham, and then you see Ibrahim and how
yeah,
that name has traveled,
yeah,
do you see how much Jewish and Judaism has really influenced
yeah, for sure. And it sort of
the
makes a
world?
nonsense of it kind of makes a nonsense of the divisions, considering it's a tree that's grown from the same roots kind of thing, in some kind of ideal world, everyone would be able to kind of appreciate the commonalities because there are many, and beyond religion, because I'm not a religious person and I'm not much of a believer. Um, we have so much in common, really, that it really ought to be able to overcome pretty much everything.
Yeah. See, that's
But
the thing about religion is I always just draw to the verses that show us how much we have in common. And I
mm,
struggle to understand why people don't see the oneness that I see. So for me, it's exactly that. I see something Islamic and then I'm really interested and I see how it connects us. It
yeah,
connects the whole world.
I think
Everything you've said today, I could completely relate to.
yeah, no, I'm not surprised. And I mean, one of the things that I don't like, for example, and so um, you get it in the Bible and in Hebrew. So there's this word, I hope I'm getting it right, but goy or goyim, which means just basically foreigners or, non-Jews is basically what it means. And then, I can't, there's a word, for example, in Japanese that just basically means anyone that's not Japanese. And I always hate um, that kind of tribalism, and that kind of perspective on life. It really
Yeah.
bugs me, whether it's about nationality or religion or whatever. One of the big issues that I have, just going back to religion, is it's so difficult to actually discuss anything when religion's involved, because you'll have a debate, and then eventually, before too long, the other person will say, well, because God said so. And then you've just hit the buffers. What are you going to say? Like, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in your God. Don't believe in my God. So that's not a great argument. But, that's kind of where it goes. If you're going to run into the wall that says God said so, it's really hard to have any kind of
But do you
debate.
think it's because how it's being taught? So, for example, when I was growing up, conveniently, because of the
Mm,
time that we lived in,
yeah,
everything was about Abrahamic faiths, the people of the book, the Jews,
yeah,
the Christians, they're part of us. The
yeah,
difference is this, but this is all that we have in common. And the
yeah,
commonality was emphasized to the extent that sometimes you just really focus more on that than the differences. But
yeah.
now, the problem I have now is it feels like the difference is being accentuated so much to the point where the children who are growing up now will only be able to see themselves as different from really children that they should have more in common with than their
Yeah.
ancestral past.
Well, I think there's a lot of fear involved, really, um, and that makes it difficult. And there's a lot of anger knocking around generally in the world, more than ever before. And that's one of the things that social media has really helped fuel, a kind of divisiveness and a tribalism.
Yeah. But I also find sometimes it's the news headlines, the constant, there's a crisis happening, but then we used to have politicians who really show you that they're managing the crisis. Now we have politicians who want you to know what the crisis is and constantly tell you how
Yeah,
it's going to affect your
I
life.
mean, politicians have always used crises and fake enemies, since time immemorial. So I'm not sure that they were any better. Maybe the best of the best were better in the past, but I'm not sure much has changed. I mean, they are strikingly mediocre nowadays, and there
Yeah.
are some real kind of horrors around. Just really kind of ignorant people that just know nothing, and are really not really capable of much either. So
Yeah.
that's a bit of a shocker, and I think that has got worse.
Yeah.
Used to, if we go back to Channel 4, you'd have, or even recently, you've got politicians talking about Channel 4 that don't even fundamentally understand how it works, how the business works, how the finances work, and they're in charge of important things. So yeah, I don't. I mean, my little contact with politicians over the years doesn't make me think there's any hope in that direction. But the crisis is used and has been increasingly used to control people, and fear has as well. But I mean, that does go back a long way, and it has been present a lot of the time, and it's easy to see those patterns. Nazi Germany, pretty good place to go looking for that kind of thing. And actually, like, it's so weird. You look at what Putin has been doing, and you look at how the Nazis operated. It's like the Nazi playbook. It's so clear. Pretty much everything he does, from the lies he tells to the kind of things he uses to justify what he's doing, it's all exactly the same. You can't put a piece of paper between them, really.
Yeah.
So
So there must be a failure on the media's part to really help inform us. There's so much time and bylines and articles that are wasted on nonsense, when really it is a time when people need to be better informed.
well,
So
I think there are people that really try hard, but there's so much noise. So just looping back to the whole new media thing, which is now just like normal media, there's so much stuff. It's really difficult to get attention to the things that matter. It's very much a kind of a struggle for attention, and it's really, really difficult. And so in terms of my day-to-day life as a commissioning editor and occasional producer, this is what you're facing all the time. How do you get anything kind of noticed? Because there's just so much of everything, and people's attention is so kind of divided. I think you know, life is a real struggle for uh, lots of people. There's a lot of fear knocking around. There's a lot of anxiety for really understandable reasons. The thing I've been working on this afternoon, actually, a trailer. Interesting. It's a trailer for film, and the words in the trailer asks a question of the film, which is, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? And you know, those are big forces that are kind of oppressing us, really. Both of those things, really, like you know, capitalism and other sort of political systems haven't really helped us live better or more comfortable lives, really. And likewise, this threat of the climate emergency also is really kind of oppressive, especially for young people.
Yeah.
Um, but
I remember.
it sort of makes me, you know, I suppose if I've got any kind of philosophy,
Yeah.
it's largely to do with appreciating the simple pleasures, really. So, you know, my blog is called Simple Pleasures Part 4, which is a reflection of the my kind of focus on the simple things that that are important in life, and that ultimately, you know, we all kind of sense that. And the other thing is, you know, every morning I have a little
You
notebook,
have
which
a
is,
post, don't you? You post mostly nature.
oh yeah, no, well that's part of it. Yeah, I try to spread a little joy via social media as best I can, but every morning I write in this notebook two things that I'm grateful for. Um, uh, just in life generally, and it's very varied.
What was it
So
today?
I was afraid you were going to ask that. What it was today was quite a contrasting pair. It was the pleasure of lying naked next to my girlfriend was number one, and number two was the Talking Heads, the band. So that's kind of quite par for the course. But
Oh,
you know,
amazing.
they're both things. You know, they're well. You know, those are two of the most important things. Love and music, pretty high up my list of priorities, really.
Yeah.
And generally, you know, I find, you know, it makes for quite a satisfying life, really, you know, to stay in touch with those things that you feel most, you know, blessed with. So I just try and stay in touch with the simple blessings. So I do it you know, I used to do it occasionally, and now I do it every day. I went every day during one of the lockdowns where I thought, shit, I need this. So it helps me keep perspective. So, you know, obviously, um, it's kind of easier to say if you're living in sort of comfortable circumstances. You know, if you're really under the cosh, appreciating the simple pleasures might be harder. But by and large, you know, most of us kind of really appreciate our children, our families, the
Mhm.
food on the table,
Mhm.
being in the warm or in the shelter or whatever. You know, I think most of us really appreciate that, and I do think that's a good general focus for the sake of kind of mental health and all that stuff. Most of us have got an awful lot to be
Grateful
great,
for.
yeah, and even people that are really sort of struggling have probably got bits and pieces to be grateful for.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there was a day when my older son was really ill, and I was in the hospital waiting with him. And it was pretty much the worst day of my life, actually, in the same way that the day he was born was one of the best days of my life. Um, that day was pretty much the worst day of my life. And what I was really surprised was that when it came to the next morning, one of the things I do, as well as two things that I'm grateful for, at the end of the day, I write down, or sometimes usually it's the next morning by the time I get around to it, I write down the three things that made me happiest. And what I was really surprised that day was that I was able to think of three things at all that had made me happy on such a terrible day. But I did come up with three things. And the other thing I remember, this is slightly random, but it's relevant to the conversation, is that we had to wait around in the hospital pretty much all day, and I had a book with me which I was reading, and it was actually a book called Jesus by A.N. Wilson, and it was a biography of Jesus. Um, and for all my kind of lack of belief, I still have a lot of respect for spirituality within religion. So I was, I was very interested in that book, and I'm interested in exploring other cultures and other religions, and I read quite a lot. That was the thing I was reading that day, and I think it was one of the three things that made me happiest in the day, because it was a kind of a sort of an escape from a very difficult situation. But then so I mean, I think that's my kind of bottom line. I think that, the simple pleasures, they cut across every religion, every ethnicity, every background, every class. We kind of pretty much all like the same stuff. The same with as in Osama loves, the stuff that all those people liked.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same stuff that we all kind of like. It's very.
What do you look for when you're commissioning projects? I always like to ask people, what is it they want to do with their output and what they're creating?
In the 2 minutes 31 seconds that we've got left, what I would say is, especially since 2008, but probably before, I always ask people that I'm working with, where's the joy in this project? So the answer is, particularly since 2008, like I say, because I think things have taken a nosedive, and things have got a lot harder. But I always ask where the joy is in the project, and if there is none, I usually think it's not worth making. And the reality is, even quite heavy subjects, you can find some sort of joy, some sort of empowerment, something uplifting. It's quite rare that it's just completely bleak.
Yes.
But so, for example, it's BAFTA season. I've been to a lot of the viewings. I saw the film Blonde, about Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
That's an interesting film, because I don't know if you've seen it, but when you look at it, I can see no joy in that film. I really wonder why it was made. And interestingly, I met the producer just before the screening, and he was weirdly apologetic. He was sort of trying to warn me about what it would be like going into the screening. And I think I know why, because it was devoid of joy, and it had nothing really positive or constructive to say in the world, really.
Yeah.
That was my abiding impression. So the answer to your question is, I always ask people, where's the joy in the project? If there isn't any, I'm quite reluctant to go ahead with it. But that doesn't mean that the projects are rose tinted glasses, because the one I just told you about, the trailer, the capitalism, the end of the world, that one's a really hard watch in many ways, but it has got something in it that has some hope in it. So hope is also really important.
Do you know what, Adam? Actually, I wish we'd spent the first whole section on this part of the podcast, actually. So you're going to have to come on, and literally we do just a whole podcast on joy and your project. Please, and your project. Yeah. When is it out?
I've really enjoyed it. It's been a good chat. Thank you.